Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being so patient. My name is Paul Ingracia. I'm the managing editor of Reuters. As a journalist and author, I've been really following the auto industry and writing about it for about 30 years now. And it occurred to me, the gentleman next to me, of course, Sergio Marchionne, needs no introduction, but it occurred to me before this session that there's been several people in the history of this industry who have saved a car company. Alan Mulally at Ford, Lee Iacocca at Chrysler back in the 80s, certainly Carlos Ghosn with Nissan. I'm not sure anybody else except for Sergio has actually saved two. And that is Fiat about a dozen years ago when it was on the brink of disaster, and then more recently Chrysler after Fiat took control of Chrysler as a result of the work of the Automotive Task Force. So it's pretty remarkable, and I think you also heard that Harry Wilson said that, well, candidly, he was against the whole Chrysler saving effort because he thought it was hopeless. Not long after you got control of Chrysler, Sergio, I was in the office of another CEO in Detroit, or another chairman in Detroit, I should say. I'm not going to mention his name, but it's a four-letter word. Anyway, he said he thought that Chrysler would be out of business in 9 months. So there were a lot of skeptics out there. So let's talk about what you found. The title of this presentation is Inside the Bailout. So take us back to those days. What potential did you see that others didn't see? What were the biggest obstacles once you got in, and what were the biggest surprises?
You mean shorter questions than that?
No, I don't do shorter questions.
No, but
you can do shorter answers.
No, but what I found was what Harry described. I mean, this is a company that had been run by a foreign entity for a long period of time that had taken all its wares on the way out. In 2006 and 2007, it had been flipped over to financially competent, industrially incompetent private equity investors who had run it for a period of time and then ran into a brick wall in the middle of a crisis. So what we ended up looking at was empty cupboards in terms of technology or product. And so we started from scratch with money that Steve gave us, roughly $7 billion, which I was not complaining. We did pay it all back, Steve, with interest, as was mentioned earlier. But it was a question of really rebuilding the company culture and rebuilding our portfolio and the business from scratch. We had a great history and a poor track record of execution. We were repeat sinners. We had to go in for a bailout back when Lee Iacocca was in. I remember I went down to see him in California after I joined, and I promised him that I'd take him back to Washington when I handed back the check, because he made a big deal of this. I remember I was in school at the time,
right,
when he showed up in Washington to pay back the feds. And then little did I realize that we were going to pay you back with a wire transfer. There was no need for me to go back to Washington. Save me.
Times have changed a little bit since.
Times have changed, and I felt a lot better about not having to go back to Washington. I mean, I thought that.
But what did you see? What potential did you see that people, Harry's a smart guy. He didn't see it.
Harry's a smart guy, but he's not a car guy.
Okay. What potential did you see?
So I'm not trying to be rude about this, but one of the biggest benefits of Chrysler was Jeep.
Okay.
And for anybody who has been following the development of Jeep over the years and has looked at the way in which it has grown in spurts internationally, you realize that, and that is part of the strategy of Fiat Chrysler and automobiles going forward, is that it's going to globalize Jeep. It's going to go from 700,000 to 1.9 million. And that's the biggest growth opportunity that we have. A lot of those things are going to come out of the U.S., not all of them. But, and it is an American brand, regardless of ownership. I mean, this thing about who owns what is really the wrong way to look at this business. I mean, Fiat, within the next 6 months, is going to have an Italian affiliate. Somebody said that Chrysler was the affiliate of a foreign company. Well, Fiat is going to be the affiliate of a Dutch company which will be listed in New York, headquartered in London, where it has 0 manufacturing facilities.
Sounds like the punchline to a bad joke.
No, but it's not. But it's life, right? It's the way in which you unfortunately, because of the way in which tax arrangements exist internationally, you provide for the flow of dividends to U.S. shareholders. It's the easiest way for us to get it done. And so it's being structured that way. So nationality doesn't matter. Brands matter, and nationalities of brands matter.
So you saw a lot
A
of potential.
Ferrari made in China is not a Ferrari. With all due respect to my Chinese colleagues, you'd sell none.
So you saw potential in Jeep.
Yeah.
So you got control of the company. Steve and his people worked with you on the deal. When you got control of the company, again, this is about inside the bailout. So what surprised you? What were the biggest obstacles? Was it worse than you thought? Was it better?
It was worse than I thought.
It was worse than you thought. How so? Be specific.
It was a state of disrepair of the house. I mean, the manufacturing environment was had been neglected for years. And so a lot of the capital that we spent about probably $8 billion between 2009 and 2013. Of all the capital that we spent at Chrysler, we spent about $8 billion just rejuvenating the infrastructure. We built more paint shops. We had to retool all the engine lines, all the transmission lines.
So this is
These are
basically
things
just
that we don't
the
talk about.
factories, just rebuilding the.
Just to give a proper work environment to our people, which is something that people forget, right? When you walk into a plant and you know that you won't use one of their bathrooms, you know this can't be the right plant, right? The state of disrepair, of neglect of the work environment that these people were offered to make a high-quality product that was supposed to compete internationally with the best of the rest, right? You can't do that when you can't even walk into the bathrooms of one of the plants because they're just unpresentable. And we've done that with bathrooms, with lunchrooms, with parking lots, with reception areas, with everything that we had done. Was just unpresentable.
So it was worse than you thought. Were there points after you took control of Chrysler where you thought, gee, I kind of wish I hadn't have done
No.
this? No, it wasn't that bad.
No, by that time I'd married Steve. And so yeah. Steve and his crew used to send me these love notes as I went through a period in 2009 and the beginning of 10 when I decided that I was going to clean up the distribution channels. And so I decided to stop giving away cars, which I thought was a very bad habit.
It's hard to make profits with that, yeah.
Kind of hard to make money. So we used to send out checks to customers and put big discounts on cars, and I stopped doing that. And our market share dropped to about 6%. And I used to get these notes from Treasury. And it was an incredibly cryptic question. When do you think the trend will turn? And I kept on answering soon. It was the best estimate that I had of the process. But we had to go, that part of it had to be done. It had to be done in a very rigorous, very disciplined way because the brand needed to be restored. And so we stopped discounting vehicles. We took our volumes down, but we took our margins up in exchange. So it was a fairly good trade. And then we spent a lot of time rebuilding the manufacturing infrastructure of the business while we were trying to resurrect the brands. And somebody made reference to the ad, which was actually not 2 years ago, it was 3 years ago, it was in 2011. But we started rebuilding the credibility of the brands by making some pretty gutsy calls. The M&M commercial that we showed in the Super Bowl of 11 was done while Treasury was still a creditor of Chrysler. And so having the U.S. government is the only lender and running commercials on M&M are not things that necessarily go hand in hand. I also had no idea whether I was going to offend the general public by using M&M in a commercial. Right? It's pretty gutsy call. Our kids on the inside said it's going to be wonderful. And then I looked at my secretary's face and I went, you know? And so not everybody was necessarily in love with M&M. I think we took some pretty, we made some gutsy move. M&M was one of them. I think for people who don't remember, but we launched the Chrysler 200, which was built on the basis of the old Chrysler Sebring.
Right.
And if there's one thing that the dealers told me when I arrived in June of 2009, is that if there's, of all the cars that we made, if there was one car that I should stop immediately in production, it was the Sebring. They said, you got to stop making that car. It's got a horrible reputation, blah, blah, blah. So we invested about $100 million. We fixed the car, fixed everything we could fix. We reworked the interiors, redid the front end, the back end.
Right.
fixed all noise, vibration, all that stuff that had to be done, that could be done on that architecture. And we relaunched the car with the Chrysler 200, and it sold more in a month than it sold in a year, because of the launch with M&M and the reestablishment of the brand. So a lot of it had to do with, we bought time. I had to buy time. I had to work on the current portfolio while I was fixing the industrial infrastructure,
Right.
and then working on the new product portfolio. And so we had to transition over 5 years, and it was a tightrope for a long period of time, because we were, I couldn't show them any really brand new cars. So we showed up at the auto show in January of 11 in Detroit, and we had 16 all new or significant, the term was significantly refreshed products.
Refresh is sort of French for
Yeah,
old products,
it's like
right?
getting a facelift,
right.
a few times. But
Right.
we did do it. We pulled it off, 16 products in less than 18 months. It gave a huge shot of adrenaline to our distribution system, and then we picked it up from there. And we spent real money. We spent nearly $3 billion on our Ram lineup, and the trucks were completely changed. Worked a lot on powertrains, on engines. Then
And one thing that hasn't quite
now.
gone as you would have perhaps hoped, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, is the Fiat brand in America.
Look, Steve and I had this discussion, but he had to nail me to a condition, and the condition was you had to bring a small car here because it's important in terms of ecology. So I made a commitment to bring the Fiat 500, and we've agreed $50,000 a year. If you had asked me at the time whether I would have committed to $80,000 or $40,000, it would have made no difference. I was going to bring the car here anyway. The Fiat 500 is an iconic, symbolic car. It's not a volume car, right? I drove here this morning from the airport, and I saw a couple of them on the road. They're cute cars, but they're not going to make up American mainstream automotive landscape. They just won't.
So basically, you brought it here because it was a condition, essentially.
It was a condition. It was one of the conditions that was assigned to the deal.
Was that a wise condition or not?
It doesn't matter,
Well-
right? This goes back to the question about how Summers defines success. You look at it 5 years later, was it worth the trip? Yeah, it was worth the trip, so do it.
I see.
It doesn't matter. I knew that I was not going to change my life, right? It was going to bring in a 4-cylinder engine that this environment needed. That was the most important thing that came with the Fiat 500. Once we got that done, the car is almost irrelevant. Don't worry about it.
I see. So,
Right? We sold 2.4 million cars last year, right?
right. So basically.
So I missed it by 10,000. That's a rounding error.
So the other aspect
I made
of
$3
this-
billion, and I said, shit, I'm going to make 3 million in 2,000. Okay.
So the other aspect of this deal that was interesting, and actually got a little public criticism at the time, was basically what happened with the secured shareholders, the holders of secured Chrysler debt. Do you want to address that? Was that appropriate?
Well, I can
not
give you my
appropriate?
answer. I can give you an industrialist answer
Please.
to this question. I was in the meeting with Steve when the news was dispersed to the interested crowd. So the bankers were in the room together with Chrysler and
Right.
me. The success of Chrysler, apart from all the product things that we've done and the proper exercise of leadership that was displayed by the team and so on, was due to the unwavering commitment of a group of people who make up the blue-collar force of Chrysler. We took those people from what I consider to be a very low position in terms of manufacturing efficiency to the point where some of these plants in the United States are comparable in terms of efficiency to some of the best plants that we have anywhere in the world. So they're coming up quickly. And it was only due because the plant workers made the commitment. It couldn't have happened otherwise. So from where I sit as the guy who runs the industrial machine,
Right.
I needed the UAW and that workforce totally committed to this project, because Harry correctly described it as being an unlikely success story. The way I describe it to people is that when you look at distribution of outcomes, we are what they refer to as the tail event. We're sitting at the tail end of a distribution. We've done it more than once because we approach these businesses in a completely different way I could never tell you a story about the old Chrysler and the new Chrysler, right? Which has been used in the past to refer to other companies that have gone through similar treatments. To me, it's Chrysler, right? I don't distinguish between the two. So there's a continuum in cultural development. These houses are fundamentally different than most other automotive houses. We run differently. We have an incredibly flat structure. There's over 25 people that work for me directly. And working for me directly means something that's completely different than it means in any other organization, because I can't talk to you every day.
Right.
Right? So your leash is going to be incredibly long because you got to be able to run the business. And so we run the house by holding each other accountable. The place is a good place to work. The pressure is incredible. The heat in the kitchen gets up pretty high from time to time. But we do deliver. You know, there is food that comes out of the kitchen. We do serve a decent lunch. So from where I sit today, trying and putting myself in their shoes back in the spring of '09,
Right.
and trying to assess the likelihood of a successful completion of Chrysler, I would have been hard-pressed to come up with the right answer. And so if you go back to the way in which the deal was structured, and I say this publicly in front of Steve because I've told him in private, I think Treasury and the U.S. government made a very clear decision back in the spring of '09 about who was going to survive as the child and who was going to put a life support system to find out whether they could make it until Christmas of that year. We were the children that were put in the support ward.
Because you had the debt
We
issue.
were given, I wasn't given $1 of equity, and everything that was given to us was given to us on a loan. It was secured. I think parts of my private parts were attached to that security.
We're not going to get too much more specific.
No, I won't. I'll leave it at that level of generality. But I think and it wasn't just my private parts. There were a bunch of other people's whose private parts were attached. It was a communal.
Let's move on.
It was a community commitment. But and so we had to prove our right to exist.
Yeah.
The other guy who got the injection was guaranteed survival. He couldn't fail. And so from their standpoint, I think once you divide the world in those two camps, your downside risk of failure with me, I mean, one, I would have never been able to do anything else in my life if I failed. I mean, forget it, my career would have been out the door. And that's what I kept on telling him. I said, look, I'm risking the only thing that I have, which is my reputation. But the simple fact that we finished and are still here is a recognition of the fact that the system that we put in place actually works in running companies, and especially works well in running car companies. Of the two solutions, being in the Chrysler world or being in the GM world, I prefer to be in the Chrysler world. I'll tell you honestly.
So you don't think you got a raw deal then, essentially?
Well, I get a raw deal because somebody said that the other guy was going to survive and I wasn't. And that kind of genetic selection I despise.
Right.
Especially for a country of this caliber and its magnitude, to make that kind of preemptive strike against somebody is a bad choice. But ignore that issue for a moment.
Okay.
If I had to come up with a system, I would have put both in the same structure. I would have forced them both to earn their right to live. Because the leash on the other side is incredibly long.
Right.
You can do a lot of mistakes in that world. And I think the urgency to change, which came with the loans, with a commitment to pay them back, that urgency did not exist on the other side.
At General Motors, you mean?
Yeah, there's only one other.
No. So,
I
mean,
try not to speak of my competitors.
Well, right, okay. So since you raised this issue, though, do you think that the process of cultural change at GM would be further along?
I know that when you're broke, you change your ways a lot faster, right?
The answer is yes.
Right?
Oh, okay.
Just change faster. You're broke.
You have no choice. You have no room for
You have no
errors.
choice. You got to make payroll on Tuesday, man. Right.
When Steve was up here, he said he hoped I would ask a question about relative manufacturing competitiveness. Where's the best place in the world? If you had to build a new car factory tomorrow, where'd you put it? Is it America, Poland?
There's no standard answer.
Okay.
The safest answer is that I have no objection to building one here. No, but that's an important step. 5 years ago, I wouldn't have.
Really?
So today I would.
And what's the difference then?
There's been a huge cultural shift in the way in which, one, industrial relations are run between the company and its workforce, and secondly, the way in which the industrial machine runs. These are different places. The places that Harry and Steve visited back in 2009 are not the same places they are today. You couldn't recognize them. It's night and day.
In terms of culture, attitude?
The culture, the technology that's in place, the way in which the cars are manufactured, the attitude of the workforce, the efficiency, the line speeds, the output of the system is completely changed. I mean, if you took a Japanese guy into our plant today, he'd be impressed. Right? He'd take us as a serious threat, which you wouldn't have done 5 years ago.
Interesting.
So where's Cliff? Is he still here? I need to find Cliff because I think he works for the Foreign Manufacturers Association. I can honestly say that I don't agree with a damn thing he said. I sat there and I went through a list.
What's your real point?
No, the comments that he made about the fact that we're going to lose this competitive battle against the imports and that we're degrading in terms of quality, and this is absolute junk. It's the kind of prognostication that you should do in your office with nobody else present. Because the real issue is that when you run a company and you're running 70,000 people, that kind of nonsense is going to destroy you. You can't. It is unreal and it's untrue. It's fundamentally untrue.
I want to open this up to questions from the audience, but one thing I want to ask you about. We talked a lot about cultural change, Sergio, at the companies. Has the UAW's culture changed?
Totally.
It has?
Yeah. So it's up to them not to go back and start drinking again. Right. I've learned my ways. I got off the sauce, right? The important thing for them is not to do it again. Yeah. And the minute that you start talking about entitlement, the moment that you start talking about things that are owed to you, right, without having a proper understanding of what is earned and what you're entitled to in a place where you share risk, which has to do with level twos and tier twos, tier one wages, right, which is my biggest problem, right, because we're going into negotiation next year. And somehow we need to get rid of this dichotomy. It can't continue. It's a wrong answer.
Two-tier wages is the wrong.
I don't have two classes of citizens inside our shops. Okay. These are people that do the same things. One guy gets paid X, and the other guy gets paid 50% of X. It doesn't work.
But that was the union's idea, though.
Yeah, but the way you do this is you grandfather the tier ones, you make them a dying class, and I don't mean that literally. You make them a dying class, so you build a tier two structure that sets the wage mechanism for the next generation and for the next two generations, where you allow people to come in, and technically when you have a bumper year, you pay them as much as a tier one would make, if not more. But if I'm on the toilet because the markets are down, or GM is successful, or Ford, the guy with the four-letter word thinks that I can't make it, and that we go down in earnings, then I think at the end of the day, you share the pain with the company.
So you're going to these negotiations seeking to eradicate...
I've tried already. I tried it the last time we took this thing around, and we couldn't get it done because we ran out of runway. But now that we're going to have a change with Dennis coming on stream in June, I think we're going to start the discussions right now, a year before the contract is up.
Questions from the audience, please. Right here on the aisle.
Hi, Alan Loeb, attorney in Washington. Chrysler Corporation, from its origins in the 1920s, had a very proud tradition of being the underdog that made its place in the market by innovation. Would you consider at this time that it's a good opportunity to sort of put that nameplate on the new Chrysler? And do you think you're ready to launch an identity of that sort?
I think the problem with that attitude is that telling people that you are the underdog gets you nowhere, right? The biggest objection that I had to the M&M commercial is that I didn't want it to look like I was looking for sympathy. Because and the first version of it, by the way, had that tone to it, and so we killed it. We weren't looking for sympathy. We were just looking for sort of a place on the stage. We had to be heard. I think you prove your value. There's a huge value in being the underdog from a leadership standpoint when you run houses. The best way to be an underdog is to live the life of the underdog and not tell anybody. Just do it. Right. The market will know.
Question back here, again on the aisle. Right.
Hi, again, I'm Levi Solomon from DOE. So you've done a
From
great job
Department
from
of
the
Energy.
Department of Energy, and I'm writing a book on the global automotive industry.
I got that the first time you told me.
Yeah, great, thanks.
And I'm going to wait for it. You said February, right?
Yes, that's right,
That's
thanks.
Just
So
wrote that down.
you've done a great job describing the way that Fiat came in and helped Chrysler rework their culture. Their styling is better, their engines are better, their engineering is better. But now, what happens going forward? The next generation of vehicles is looking towards much more intensive electrification,
Yeah.
fuel cell vehicles, automated
Fuel
vehicles.
cell vehicles, I'm not so sure, but certainly electrification, yes.
Right, and so could you talk a little bit about your plan for the future from a technology perspective?
Well, look, there are two issues. The first one is, and this goes back to Cliff's comments about electrification, self-guided cars, and all this nonsense. The problem that you have is that all this technology that you're putting into vehicles has got a price tag. And so we run analysis all the time about what the effectively our ability to transfer the cost onto the consumer is going to be like as we roll out these technologies. And one of the things that we've come to realize is that although electrification is talked about a lot, that from an economic standpoint, there's nobody out there who makes any money electrifying vehicles. Nobody, with the exception of Tesla, which only makes electric cars and it sells them at rather inordinate pricing. We're going to be forced to walk into electrification for a variety of reasons. One, because of California and there's ZEV mandates, which are keep on moving the impositions back on car makers to produce cars that have zero-emission vehicles. There are zero-emission vehicles. And the other one is because of the initiative that was put in place by Obama back in 2011 with the new emission rules, which effectively are binding the industry until 2025. So our evaluation of all this is that in order for us to maintain the same type of fleet in terms of size that you've got out there, is that hybrids are going to run more than 50% of the fleet in the U.S. and in all likelihood close to three-quarters by the time that 2025 comes around. So the house is ready. We'll roll it, okay? But it has to be associated. It can't be done on pure electrification. It needs to be run in conjunction with combustion. And we need to finish all our work on combustion. Combustion still has a lot of unexplored areas, which will continue to yield efficiencies, and the combination of that and electrification will give the right answer. But it's going to take time. But we'll be there. We've been doing all the work up to now, so it's not. I hate, by the way, showing up and saying, rolling out as a CEO of Fiat Chrysler and showing you the new 500 electric, which I do have. I hope you don't buy it, because every time I sell one, it costs me $14,000. Right? So I'm honest enough to tell you that I will make the car, I'll make it available, which is my requirement, but I will sell the limit of what I need to sell and not one more. The Volt for GM, since we're talking about competitors, I don't think that at that price level it can make money. Right? And it can't make the volumes. So at that point in time, if we just build those vehicles, we'll be back in Steve's successor's office in Washington asking for a second bailout because we'll be bankrupt by Christmas. So we got to run the business, we got to combine technology, and I've had long conversations with the secretary on this issue about de-emphasizing electrification and making sure that we continue. The best thing you can do as DOE is to set the target and let industry get there. We'll find the right mixture of technology to deliver mileage and CO2 reductions. We're much better at this than you are. I hate to tell you this.
Now, it's interesting about fuel cells. You expressed some skepticism, but Toyota, with Mr. Yuichi Yamada, who's the father of the Prius, is placing a big bet on fuel cells.
We all are. Somebody needs to prove to me that if you're going to use fossil fuels to produce hydrogen, then you're going to end up with a carbon footprint that's more beneficial than using combustion today. Prove that to me, and then I'll listen to you.
Okay.
If you're really interested in saving the environment, tell me how you're going to do fuel cells without providing a worse answer that you got running combustion today.
This gentleman here, please.
Thank you. I'm Federico Pellegrini. I'm Corporate Affairs and Corporate Finance intern here at YSA. I have a question about CSR in the sense of corporate stakeholder responsibility. In the establishment of the brand, did you go through a strengthening of the CSR, so investments in a better stakeholder relationship? And if you think that it has been perceived by your investors?
The answer is, it's easier for me to answer the questions in reverse order. I can guarantee you that it's never been perceived properly by our investor base. Because as much as I think we emphasize it internally as a matter of corporate choice, the equity markets are absolutely insensitive to this issue. I think you're young enough to start working the street here because you need to convince a lot of people that it's important.
It's about the Miami thesis, so...
There you are. I'll introduce you to our investor relations people. There's a huge disconnect between all the work that we do on that issue and substantial involvement of management and financial resources to the achievement of those internally developed targets in the way in which the market appreciates it.
Question over here, please.
Mr. Marchione, in the opening remarks, you referred to the structure of the arrangement Mr. Ratner provided to your institution. I suppose the question is whether you could dispel some of the nonsense, if you excuse me, or the canard, that there were private sector solutions which could be provided to Chrysler, which provided a much better haircut relative to the one Mr. Ratner proposed at the time.
I think we can speculate. Two comments. All the critics that have attacked the bailout, and I can tell you from somebody who, unfortunately at the time, was also the vice chairman of a relatively large bank in my spare time, that the financial system was absolutely incapable of digesting anything, never mind a bankruptcy of this caliber. So you can get it out of your head. If you thought that I could sell Jeep to anybody, you couldn't have sold it for 50 cents. The value of Jeep as a brand today is a multiple of the 50 cents. Let's not debate how much of what multiple that is, but it's a much different number. At that time, the digestive system of not just the US system, but international financial structure could not digest a bankruptcy, not even Chrysler's, certainly not GM's. And there are people, and I think a gentleman here from Michigan made reference to the fact that the devastating impact on the supplier base would have been so large that it would have actually frozen Ford in its tracks. It could have not produced the car. The failure of GM and the failure of Chrysler would have sent the supplier base into absolute convulsions. And if that happened, they would have stopped making parts for Ford. So you would have had a chain effect that would have just destroyed the US automotive business completely. So don't look for alternative solutions. There were none. And I can tell you that the deal that was put together by Steve and his team was an incredibly tough deal. It was a private equity deal that, as I said, had a very short leash. If we had sneezed the wrong way and we had not delivered it, they would have taken it back into GM because GM had all the cash, right? They could have just absorbed Chrysler and done Plan B, which was their Plan B at all times, is to put these two companies together. And I think the only reason, I don't want to get involved in the entrails of the discussions that happened inside Treasury. I know for a fact that Harry was against it. And Steve was mildly in favor. I think Larry was supporting it at the time. But I think the UAW and the fact that they insisted on the continued existence of Chrysler as a separate entity went a long way. I think they were helpful. And I think in hindsight, there was go back to Larry Summers' yardstick, right? 5 years later, was the right thing to do? And the answer is yes. So, the best deal they could have done at the time.
All right, time for just one more quick one, if there's one more. And if not, Steve Ratner, why don't you ask the last questions? Very appropriate.
I was just going to comment. I was trying to be quiet, but I just was going to comment on two things that Sergio said. And look, first, let me say a couple things, actually. First, it was a very close decision whether to save Chrysler or not. I think Sergio's analysis that we would have been out of our minds to let it go may well be right, but it was in fact a close decision. And there is no way, the thing that was absolutely central to our thinking was it had to have a world-class management team. And if we had not had Sergio, actually we would have let it go, rightly or wrongly, because we had no other world-class management team. So having Sergio and Fiat was absolutely central to the decision. I would just comment on two things you said. First, I think you are right and you are fair to say that we did not send Chrysler off on the same basis that we sent General Motors off. But the reason we did that was we felt as stewards of the taxpayers' money, we could not put more money into Chrysler than the minimum that we thought was reasonable for it to have a chance to succeed. And so yes, it was more leverage than General Motors, but that's why.
And the only comment I made, Steve, is that I think GM should have been given the same treatment. It would have made them into better people.
Well, you have to take that. You have to take
It
that.
worked
up with
for me. I went straight.
Yeah. Okay. And the second thing I would say, just to correct the record, is that the idea of merging GM and Chrysler, the reason that did not happen was not because of the UAW. It was because GM did not want to do it. Because their position was
We were rejected by everybody, including GM. You've broken my heart now, Steve.
Well, no, but look, Rick Wagner's position was, and Fritz's too, that they were in the process of going from 8 brands to 4 brands, so why would they want to go back to 6 or 7 brands?
That's a good answer.
That's a good
That was their answer.
That's why we split up Dodge into Ram to create another one to make it even more difficult for them to absorb us. I like that story.
Sergio, I want to thank you, and I want to thank this audience. It's been great.
Thank you very much.